Howdy, y'all. Welcome back, Bev. How are y'all? Dave, too. You only care for my kids, right? So, I mean, it's all good. We are in the Gospel account of Mark this morning. We are in chapter 6. What was the very last topic we discussed last week at the end? Do y'all remember? Not all at once. John lost his head. How dare... Yeah, absolutely right. John the Baptist was killed by whom? Herod, right? Herod number 2 or 3. So we're picking up here in verse 30. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught, right? So where were they sent? They're coming back, right? So they were sent on the limited commission, right? To the people that were probably mostly Jewish. They were given regulations about what they could and could not bring with them. For example, they couldn't bring any money. They couldn't bring their second tunic. Couldn't bring any besides a walking staff, right? So they have this idea that they were being sent out by Jesus. They had the ability to perform miracles and cast out demons. And they were going to we would call it a village nowadays. You go to a certain location, a certain household. You'd preach the message. Anyone recall what the main message was at this point in time in the Gospels? Okay, repent for the kingdom of heaven is at hand, right? And so if they receive that message, good. If not, you shake the dust off your feet and you move on to the next place, right? So they came back and told Jesus what they had been teaching. Verse 31, he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while, for many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat." And so we talked about a little bit of a tangent at the end of last class, which is my specialty, is tangents, about the idea of if Jesus and the apostles needed to rest after they did their work for the Lord, we are in the same boat, right? And speaking of that, verse 32, and they went away in the boat to a desolate place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they ran there on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. So it's kind of like, in my mind anyway, it's almost like, rock stars. You go from city to city, and there are some groupies that follow them around wherever they're going to go. And so the idea here, if we know who Jesus is in a way, not really, but we know who he is. He's the guy that can perform miracles and heal people and all that kind of business. And they were following them wherever they went from town to town to hear more about the message, hopefully, but also because there were miracles occurring, and that was a pretty wild thing before TVs were invented. What else are you going to do with your time, right? Paparazzi, maybe. I think the scribes were the paparazzi, right? Trying to catch them in the right situation. Anyway, verse 34, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd. What does your translation say that's different than the ESV? Is it still a great crowd? Huge crowd? Okay. Any New King James users out there? Yeah, probably multitude, right? Anyone verify that for me? Yeah? 33, 34. Yep. He went ashore. He saw a great multitude. Yeah, okay. Multitude. Yeah, that word right there in the King James, New King James used to mean something when it comes to like how many rough estimate numbers you might have. It doesn't really help us here because in just a little bit we have an actual head count, which is helpful. He had compassion on them. That's the Greek word for, we would say, butterflies in your stomach, right? You ever see something or experience something and you have a physical gut reaction to it? you have butterflies in your stomach, or you feel some churning, or whatever the case. That Greek word there is literally your insides or your intestines are moving, which is pretty gross in the English when you just translate it literally. But the idea is he had compassion on them, right? He was literally, physically moved with his physical emotion because, and here's why he had that kind of visceral reaction, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Now, why is that important? Yeah, well, there's a whole shepherding thing talked about a little bit later on in the book of John, for example. He's the good shepherd. His sheep know his voice. There it is, Doug. Been waiting. It wasn't that loud. It was dramatic for sure, but not that loud. And then what else about a shepherd and sheep and so on? Bible 101 for you.
Where they needed to go.
Okay.
And if there was any lost, he made sure that they were found. So him being, quote, the great shepherd, here was his flock that needed protecting and direction. That sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good. Good job. What else? There's a little bit more here.
He protected his sheep.
Okay, y'all are hitting it, but
Kill a lion, kill a bear,
It
that's
talks
a
about the sheep
Yeah.
and how the shepherd is the gate for the sheep. He lays
Yeah.
down at the gate so that nothing can come into harm.
okay, let me ask the question in a different way. 'Cause y'all got good answers, but not where I'm going to go. So I'm not going to ask you to be a mind reader. Are there any other shepherds in the Bible that were important? Okay, David was one, right? Who else? Oh, okay, yeah, yes, yeah. All right. Yeah, spiritually, yeah. Jacob, Moses, yeah, that's who I was thinking of, was Moses. How long was he a shepherd? Can we estimate? About 40 years, taking care of his father-in-law's flock, right? So 40 years in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd, which prepared him really well for 40 years of leading the Israelites, right? Anyone here grow up having sheep? Is that a thing in Middle Georgia? No? Okay. Cows and horses? All right. Well, in West Virginia, when I was preaching up there, I talk about sheep. I did not grow up on a farm by any stretch of any imagination, right? And so the idea of being a shepherd, I'm like, okay, you take care of sheep, whatever. But when I talked about it in West Virginia, everyone had a story because they all had sheep growing up, usually for lawn maintenance, right? And so the number one complaint I had when I said shepherd or sheep, they go, ugh. I go, what is that? I have no idea what that is. And that reaction was, I remember it was 5 o'clock in the morning on a Monday, and I had school that day, and one of our dumb sheep just jumped over the fence, and we had to go out there with flashlights and find this sheep that just ran off because he was just so dumb, he didn't know to stay where it was safe and protected. And so it's interesting that the more I learned about how sheep are mentally deficient when it comes to safety and everything, and then in the Bible, we're called the flock of God. It's an interesting point there. Faye? Okay, let's hear it.
Walter's brother-in-law managed a ranch in Texas that had some sheep on it. And we went out to eat one day and came back, and we got in the golf cart, and he took us around to see the sheep. Well, there was a sheep laying with his feet straight up, wasn't moving. We thought it had died. Oh no, we don't want to go up there and see it. But he had to go up because he's the manager. It wasn't dead. It was pregnant and had started down the hill, lost his balance and flipped over, and he couldn't get up. So he had to have the shepherd turn.
Yeah, you know. It's not the smartest of animals. And then well, fair enough. You know, fair enough. I've not been pregnant and rolled down a hill. Yeah, you're right, Lisa. Don't know why I didn't think about that one first. Yeah, what? The goat man?
Goat man trouble all over.
One of those middle Georgia folk legends or something?
It was real, but he was real. Up in the middle of Georgia.
Anyway, yeah, I didn't walk down that one. I didn't chase that sheep this time. So anyway, it's interesting that when God talks about the elders of a congregation, what terminology does he use? Shepherd's a pretty good one, right? Like the under shepherd, the hireling shepherd, right? He's the great shepherd, and they're the ones that are under him. So, excuse me, taking care of the sheep of the church. Some points to be made there. I'm just going to leave that right there. Y'all can pick it up or lay down, whatever you want to do. Just think about whenever you feel too hot or too cold, who do you run to? Yeah, Shepherd Todd. And every time he gives me this look like, oh, these sheep, I'll tell you what, can't make them all happy. I'm like, hey, you know, is what it is. What's that? As long as I'm happy, y'all happy, right? All right, so he began to teach them many things. So now we're kind of transitioning for a second away from the miracle man, Jesus, right, and going into a more didactic Jesus. You know what that word means? It's one of those $5 words, right? So didactic is from the Greek, of course, because it means someone that teaches, right? Didache means to teach from the Greek. So didactic means he's now in the mode of someone who is a teacher for a profession, right? Whenever I use fancy words like that someone taught me way back in the day, I want to make sure y'all know what I'm talking about, because I've heard a bunch of words. I'm like, okay, that word means something. Don't know what it is, but there you go. Verse 35, when it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate place. You might see desert place in some translations, but the word desert there, I would tell you, hey, that word desert doesn't mean desert, it means desolate. So here we go. Thank you, ESV. And the hour is now late. Verse 36, send them away to go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. So just practicality here. It's one of those things that if you're not looking for it, it doesn't really show up that much. But as soon as you kind of clued into it for a second, you really get it. I mean, sometimes we have the tendency to look at the scriptures and see the spiritual, which is good. But at the same time, people wrote this text down. They're talking about a day in their lives, or in the lives of Jesus, right? And so there's a lot of practical, just logistical planning that goes into it. I mean, if you're a member of this congregation, you know so much stuff, how many events we do. And making it from here's an idea to here's the actual event, there's a lot of that logistical planning that goes on, right? To say the least, right? And so the people working behind the scenes to make sure enough hamburgers and hot dogs are bought, that we have charcoal, that we've got water, all that kind of stuff that we just kind of take for granted sometimes, unless you're the one doing it. They had that same problem here in the first century. If you've got a great multitude or a great many people there, hey, it's good that they're there to learn, and Christ will be teaching them. At the same time, the day's coming to an end. They got to sleep somewhere. No doubt they're hungry. No doubt there's a well somewhere near they have to draw water from. So here's one of those practical, logistical things that we see. Just, hey, it's the end of the day. We've got a great number of people here. How are we going to feed them? And then you've got verse 37. But Jesus answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said, shall we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat? So what's a denarius? Hey, y'all know that already. All right, see? Denarii is plural for denarius. A denarius was a little silver coin, right? And the way that we kind of talk about it from just a practical standpoint is if you were a blue-collar laborer, which is a very fancy way in the first century to say slave, and you worked for somebody else for one day, you receive one denarius, right? It's a whole day's worth of labor. So he's saying, do you want us to spend 200 days of labor worth of money to go buy them bread? Like, do we even have that? Who was the, stepping away from Mark, who was the guy in charge of the treasury? I mean, of all people, right? Showed his heart real quick. And he said, verse 38, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they had found out, they said 5 and 2 fish, or 2 fishes, right? So you got this number of people, a great number of people. You've got 5 loaves of bread, and you've got 2 little fish. How far is that going to go? Well, there's 2 answers, and they're both right. And it all depends on who's handing it out, all right? So Lynn, for our Monday night for the Master, I want you to get 5 loaves of bread and 1 can of sardines and feed everybody that shows up. You got it? On a diet. He commanded them to all sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups by hundreds and fifties. What does that mean? What's that?
A lot of people.
A lot of people. But they were all kind of like grouping up together, right? You had little groups forming of 100 over here, 50 over here, that kind of deal, right? And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, because of course, you know, heaven is upward, right? It says so right there. You got to look up. If you look down, where are you looking? Hell? To the ground? Yeah. It's funny, if you, you can go down a huge rabbit hole here if you want to. I wouldn't recommend it because it gets confusing. But there are charts out there and images that show you what the Jewish people thought about how our planet existed. And it's pretty fascinating, because when you think about the Earth or the planet, what do you think of immediately? What's that? A globe, okay. Layers. Did they know the Earth was kind of like a sphere back in the day?
They did in the Old Testament.
Kinda, yeah. There's some stuff in there about the circle of the Earth, right? So just generally, though, no, it's a little like, how does God describe the Earth? Well, we're here on the earth or on the ground, and then you have the pit, or you have Sheol below us, which is just where you go when you die. And then you've got the heavens where the birds fly, and then the heavens where the stars are and all those lights at night. And then you've got the heavens where God is. And so you kind of have this image of we're right there in the middle of this sandwich, and you've got the pit below us, and we've got heaven where God is above us. And that was their worldview. They weren't too concerned about, how many miles around this globe you could go before you got to yourself again, right? Just the idea of just where you were in relation to God and the grave was kind of their worldview. So anyway, looking up to heaven, and said a blessing. Let's pause right there. What does it mean to say a blessing?
Thank God.
Thank God. Okay. So you've got 4 gospel accounts total, right, that are authorized or approved or canon or whatever you want to say. And you've got 2 of them talking about the Lord's Supper, and you have Jesus blessing the bread, right, for the Lord's Supper, for the Passover meal. And then you got 2 of them saying that he gave thanks for the bread. Which one's right? Yeah, they're both right. So if you're looking for a definition for blessing the bread or blessing food, it means to give thanks. There are other ways that word blessing is used, but that's one talking about food specifically. So said a blessing or gave thanks for it. He broke the loaves, which, by the way, indicates they're likely unleavened bread, right? Just kind of a little fact for you. If you got leavened bread, you don't break it that much. If you have unleavened bread, you got to break it, right? You've had unleavened bread before, right? Like the real stuff, on the little square we get. We got a big old flat sheet of bread, you might say. It looks like a cracker, and you break it off, right? and gave to the disciples and set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces, end of the fish, and those who ate the loaves were 5,000 men. So you got 5,000 people here total, right?
Or because more women were interested than the men were.
Well, I don't know about that statement right there. It seems a bit too pointed. But in my church experience, you are right. Women seem to be more interested than men are. You know the trick to converting a household, right? Convert the wife. Y'all like that joke or not? Seriously, though, if you want the husband to be pressured to come to worship, make sure the wife's on board. You want the kids to be grown to the church? Make sure the wife's on board. Just being practical, just saying what's worked before. Okay, so we have a miracle, it seems, occurring here, right? You got 5 loaves of bread, you got 2 little fish, and somehow they just kept having bread, kept having fish, and they all ate, let's just say 15, 12,000, something like that, people, which, by the way, if you don't know what that looks like, that's more than just a crowd, right? We've got a mob on our hands here that are all hungry and they're all starving, and here's Jesus feeding them. So it's an interesting dynamic here because you've got them showing up, and to give them the benefit of the doubt, we would say they probably came there likely because they wanted to hear about the teaching of Jesus. At this point in Mark especially, we've really transitioned, it seems, from them just saying, hey, we've got sick people and you can heal them. We got a whole bunch of people showing up just because they heard of where they were going, right? So it's not just the sick people anymore, it seems. They are invested. They're interested in what this guy is doing. And it seems almost like because they sat through the whole day seminar with Jesus, he's like, all right, well, just to kind of thank you guys for what you've sacrificed to be here, here's a nice meal for you, right? Continental breakfast for all of you guys to close out our seminar. Okay, questions, comments?
I have one.
Yep.
We've had reports from Malawi with the Zuzu campus there, and they have meetings, and they have people come in from all over the country and even other countries to those meetings. But when they come in, guess what? They feed them,
Yeah.
and that's a part of the culture that they have.
Right. We kind of have to, right?
Yes.
I did my extensive 2-week trip in Kenya, which is minimal. I'm just sarcasm, right? It wasn't a whole lot, but I was blown away by how many people we had met. And Charles, our main preacher guy for that little area, was like, she's come from this location. And I go, okay. Because she walked it. I was like, okay. I don't have any context for what that means. I was like, well, she walked, and she woke up last night at 10 o'clock at night and began walking. And she's walked the entire night and the entire day to get here just to hear your sermon. So, oh, no pressure, right? Do a good job, right? But she just went because she heard, hey, there's a guy talking about the Bible. I want to know more about it. And she'd walk all night and all the next day to get there for that evening worship. And she brought water with her, but that was about it. Whatever she came up to and whatever she received, she was thankful. And then when we were done, she said, all right, have a good night, and walked back home. So, I mean, yeah, it's definitely different than us maybe having a little bit of anxiousness about $4 a gallon for a gallon of gas, driving to church. Yeah, it's 20 minutes away. I don't know if I feel like it. That's kind of a change in attitude when you experience something like that, right? So it is important to keep things in mind like that.
People that were there and stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
And here's Jesus, and there is no PA system.
I know, right?
But they continue to stay, either because by some miracle they were able to hear, or they wanted to stay and hear. through hunger, heat, whatever.
Right. It was important. I mean, we know it's important. We're talking about it right now, right? 2,000 years later. But it was important to them, and they could pick up on that enough to be like, okay, this is something very significant that we're experiencing together. It always blows my mind how, yeah, they didn't have microphones, but everybody could hear everybody, right? In a sense, or at least the first row heard it and passed it. What do you say? Oh, this. And no hearing aids back then, no cell phones going off. So I mean, it was a different world. It blew my mind when I read Ezra, I think it's Ezra, where they read the law again for the first time back in Jerusalem, and everyone paid attention to what the person was saying that was reading the scriptures, and even the children were there. I'm like, there's no way, that's just God being a bit zealous there. There's no way the children just sat there like, oh, yes, of course. And a stranger in the gate is supposed to behave this way. It blows my mind about how it's talked about in Scripture sometimes. What's that?
They read, they stood in reverence.
Yeah, as opposed to sitting down. The rabbi would sit, ironically. Okay, verse 45. Immediately, thanks Mark, he made his disciples to get into the boat and go before him to the other side, or go first, to Bethsaida, where while he dismissed the crowd. And after he had taken leave of them, he went up on the mountain to pray. Why do you think he went up on the mountain to pray? What's that?
Commune with God alone.
Right, so to be with God, you have to go up to be with God, right? So, well, I mean, okay, let me rephrase it. That wasn't a joke, which y'all laugh anyway. Biblically, remember the world image I talked about? So below you is the pit, and above you is heaven. And so in their mind, to get closer to heaven, you have to go up vertically to a mountain, right? And that huge image of going up to the mountain is an image used in Scripture for a long time, right? And so all the altars before there was the tabernacle and the temple, they were all on the mountaintops or mountainsides, because you have to get closer to God to make your sacrifice so he can smell it, right? Or he can see it. So the idea of going up a mountain biblically is to get closer to God, in a sense. We know it's not literal. God's everywhere. He's in us and so on. But that biblical imagery of going up the mountain, and then Isaiah took it to the next level, because that's Isaiah for you. I mean, he's 700 years before Christ. That's a long time, right? And he's talking about everyone's going to say, hey, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord's house and learn from him. Which, if you're Jewish, you don't have to do that, because your parents teach you about God. But here are other people, not of the Jewish world, being taught by their parents, saying, hey, I want to know more about him. Let's climb this mountain. And that's in a picture, a symbolic picture of all of us saying, hey, I didn't grow up knowing about God, but now that I am an adult, I'm responsible for my actions. I want to go up to the mountain of the Lord's house and learn about who he is. We all made that decision if we're Christians, right? Bev?
That King Solomon, when he built the temple for the Lord, wasn't that up on Mount Moriah maybe? And even if the people would just look up towards the temple, God could hear them.
Wasn't it Mount Zion?
Yes, it was Mount Moriah. Maybe, I don't know.
Moriah was a different one, I think. But but yes, same point. Faye?
Yes, and even the kings of Israel, when they put idols out for people to worship, they put them in the high places.
Yeah, so it's an image that we get. We know that God's not literally closer to you when you go up a mountainside, but it's just the imagery here from Scripture. Which, by the way, a lot of stuff is like that in Scripture, too.
And God was his father. It's habit or being taught, or just the fact you get wonderful solitude by going up in the mountain. So I always thought that not necessarily he was trying to get closer to God, because he knew who he was.
Right.
He was just getting away to a really quiet place so that he could pray.
Yeah. It's definitely a factor in it as well, but if I don't mention the whole going up the mountain thing, a lot of the Old Testament going up the mountain things may not make sense to you. When Moses was called, where was he? Yeah, I saw a burning bush on the mountain, communing with God. And then when he got the Israelites finally and brought them there, they wanted to go. God wanted them to go up the mountain, but they were terrified of him because he revealed some version of his form. So anyway, up a mountain, right? Verse 47, when evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on land. And he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. If you're on a sailboat, let's just use that for example, and you're trying to get to the other side of the sea, and the wind is coming this way, how in the world are you supposed to make it that way when you're a sailboat? Got to row? Tack it? Right. So that was the Phoenicians, and they were the first ones to really nail this thing down. You can't just go, hey, right into the wind with a sail, right? You've got to go a little bit to the right, a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. It's a lot slower, is the idea. And so the idea of using the wind to your advantage but going the opposite direction is a pretty advanced thing the Phoenicians figured out. So they were kind of doing that, right? So you're not going full speed ahead. You're kind of going to the right, to the left, to the right, and you're making your way slowly. That's what we're talking about here. And about the fourth watch of the night. Anyone know when that is? It's one of those biblical Roman things.
3 a.m. to 6 a.m.
What's that?
3 a.m. to 6 a.m.
All right, someone's got a footnote, I can guarantee it. All right, 3 to 6 a.m. So right when it's time for me to think, you know what, I should go to bed now. He came to them walking on the sea. This, again, is one of those moments I wish I just had a picture of what in the world that looked like. I want to know so bad. Question is, was he just like walking on the surface? If a wave came along, did he go up the wave? Or was he kind of like an inch or two in the water and just kind of, I don't know what it looked like, but he's walking on the sea. Okay, thanks, Mark. He meant to pass by them. You ever pass by somebody on the highway that's broken down? You're like, well, I would have stopped, but I'm just trying to make my way to pass by them. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out because they all saw him and were terrified. That word terrified there is pretty funny in the Greek. It's the idea of literally almost passing out, right? So almost fainting is the old King James way of saying it. So he was just trying to walk by him and like, who is that walking? It's a ghost. And they were all freaking out. But immediately, thanks Mark, he spoke to them and said, take heart, it is I, don't be afraid. Y'all busted me. I was trying to walk by on the water next to you, but here we go. He got into the boat with them and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. What? Seems a little out of left field, doesn't it? They were astounded because they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Well, I got to tell you, Mark, it would make a whole lot more sense for us if you would just write, because he was walking on the water in the middle of the night. But, I mean, you threw this thing in here. What's your ideas about that? A curveball.
They were still trying to figure out the loaves and the fish,
But their hearts were hardened?
and their hearts were hardened. They could only focus on one thing.
Okay.
They didn't know what to accept. I mean, and it wasn't the time. I mean, God had a time set for them to understand all things, and it wasn't this time.
For sure not. They didn't understand a whole lot. I wouldn't be in the category of understanding any more than they would have, for sure. They've been through some stuff, right? I mean, who has been through what they've been through up until this point in history? I mean, really nobody. I mean, you can conjecture and say the folks that were in Elisha's prophet school, whatever you want to call that little camp in 2 Kings, that was pretty wild, which if you've not read that before, or it's not fresh in your memory, I love teaching that text just because it's just so weird, right? They're trying to chop down a tree, right? This is Elisha and all the school of the prophets that were there, right? So all those little prophets. And they're trying to learn how to be a prophet, which is a good thing. And so they're in this little like commune situation, and they borrow an axe, and they chop down a tree, and the axe head flies off and goes into the water. And then Elisha shows up, and what happens? The axe head literally swims to them. Which I don't know what you think that means, but I know what my brain tells me it means, which is not all right. Is that axe head that was made of metal became rubber, and he just swam like a fish right to him. Right? And they made a stew one day because they were all hungry. So what do? You make a stew. I mean, I like stew, so that's a good plan. But there was death in the pot. They put something in there that was not meant to be eaten. So what happens? Elisha just fixes it. Kind of weird, right? Like not a normal, like, well, you have David and Goliath. It's a little bit out there. You like kids can't easily grasp all those little weird stories. And here is one of those weird stories. They were in the boat. They're still just kind of reeling from the fact that, hey, we had like 12,000 people, and we had 5 loaves and 2 fish, and he fed them all, and we've got leftovers. Where are we going to put leftovers? There's no refrigeration yet. What in the world's going on? There's no Tupperware out here, right? So here they're on the boat, and they're having a hard time. They're still freaking out about it. And then they see a ghost, and they're all thinking they're going to die. They're like, oh, it's just me. Like, oh, of course it's just you, walking on the water as you do. So it's just everything here is just turning their world upside down, is I think the point. Their hearts being hardened. There's a whole other conversation about having someone harden their hearts, for example, but they weren't quite fully ready to accept it and receive it all, it would seem. They're still just trying to figure it all out. Okay. Is there going to be a bell? When do I stop? 15 after? At 3 minutes? Oh, that's great. All right, any questions, comments? Who's the guy in charge of the bell? I need to know. For an unrelated reason. Tim is? Ted. Ted Keith? Oh, Ted. Thought we were friends. Okay. Any questions, comments? I don't want to go on to Gennesaret yet.
They've been out teaching and preaching and had the capability to do miracles, which you assume they did, and then something like this, like, oh well.
Yeah.
Just move on.
Well, it's coming up against things they have never seen before, never heard about before. It doesn't fit into their scope of what they know. Scriptures to say, it's just, it's something totally new that they're having to come to grasp and understand. That's why it took the miracles.
Yeah.
Well, to understand that this was something that was approved by God.
You got a guy who's a zealot, and you can read into that all you want to, but back in the day, they were the folks that were willing to assassinate and overthrow tyrants. That's who they were. Now he's following Jesus, the King of Peace, right? You got a guy who's a tax collector for the Romans, and then he was called, and he's hanging out with a zealot, of all people. You got 4 fishermen who their whole life they're thinking, I'm going to be in this boat like my daddy was, and I'm going to be catching fish and selling at the market. It's going to be my life. And here they are in a boat in the middle of the sea. They're having a hard time. They're seeing stuff that they can't even begin to explain. It's a lot to take in, right? And so for anyone that looks at the scriptures and say, I can't see myself in it, I can't relate to that culture at all, like, okay, the culture is different. But they were people just like us. And we have a story, and they had stories, and they went through some wild stuff to get to the men that we realize were the apostles of Christ. Okay, that's going to be it for this morning. We're going to pick up in verse 53, Lord willing, next week. And we'll be dismissed now for about 20 minutes before worship begins. All right? Thank you all.